Breath of the Wild is considered to be one of the greatest video games of all time. That's a fairly uncontroversial statement, right? It revolutionized aspects of the open world genre and helped sell Switches at launch to such a degree that Nintendo have their first universally beloved home console in over a decade. So what exactly did Breath of the Wild do to not only earn such critical acclaim but resonate with people so much that Breath of the Wild 2 is now one of the most anticipated games of this generation? I should add that this isn't a review, as I don't discuss certain aspects of the game that I loved, such as the music, although I do talk about certain aspects of the game that could have been implemented better. Essentially, these are the reasons why I think Breath of the Wild will be remembered as one of the greatest and most important video games of all time. Oh, and maybe don't watch if you haven't completed the game because... spoilers? First things first, we need to talk about why Breath of the Wild became Breath of the Wild, and that reason is Skyward Sword. I should preface this by saying I actually enjoyed Skyward Sword. Personally, I thought it had a fun and unique story. It had some of the best dungeons from the recent Zelda games, and the characters were huge and so often hilarious. We still need a spin-off adventure game starring Groose, by the way. But it was extremely linear. And the controls, well, let's just say that they were temperamental. Skyward Sword wasn't a bad game, it was just pushing Zelda in a direction further than its origins. And Nintendo knew this. The response from critics was unanimously positive, but a lot of Zelda fans weren't convinced, and it sold poorly. So what changed? In 2013, the team at Nintendo, led by Zelda god himself, Eiji Aonuma, knew that it was time to rethink the conventions of Zelda. They wanted to reset the series and to shatter expectations, because after 30 years they knew that the Zelda series had become formulaic. And while that isn't necessarily a bad thing, it does mean that fans had come to expect a certain way of beating a Zelda game, and that formula was beginning to feel stale. So how does Breath of the Wild differ from recent Zelda titles? Well, it differs because it actually embraces its history and origins, the NES title. The original Legend of Zelda was our first real glimpse at an open-world game. It was daring, adventurous, and gave you a sense of freedom that hadn't yet been experienced in a video game before. And that's what Aonuma and the gang tapped into. Because at the heart of each Zelda game is exploration, and fundamentally that's what Breath of the Wild focuses on. That doesn't mean to say that inspiration didn't come from outside. Nintendo admitted that they looked at Western open-world RPGs like Skyrim, but instead of just mimicking a style of gameplay, they just said, how about you can just climb anything? Though it's such a simple addition, the ability to climb anything actually works to perfection because the route to your destination is now how you choose it to be, and is therefore influenced by how you would like to play the game. And sure, you can only climb for a limited amount of time before your stamina runs out, but that brings with it tactics, decision making, and even more choices. Climbing to the top of a mountain and jumping off with your paraglider always feels enthralling, and never fails to show just how beautifully crafted Hyrule is. As well as implementing a climb all system, Breath of the Wild also encourages you to experiment with your surroundings, and this experimentation is dictated by the physics engine. Aonuma said that the physics engine makes objects in Hyrule react in a logical and realistic way, which in turn gives you, the player, the freedom to attempt challenges in a number of different ways. Say for instance, there's a thunderstorm. You could, in theory, throw your steel sword at an enemy just as lightning strike to deal an incredible amount of damage. But hold on to it too long, or even worse, ignore it, and that lightning is only going to cause you pain. Exploring different locations in Hyrule also brings with it new challenges, especially if you've only enhanced certain armor, because most areas feel unique and have their own obstacles to face in their own specific way. You're cold? Throw a jumper on. You're hot? Wear a boiler suit, apparently. You're a man? Well, stay out of Gerudo Town. The physics engine goes beyond implementing a weather system too, because it also introduces the Sheikah Slate, which is essentially Link's very own Magic Wii U gamepad. With the Sheikah Slate, you gain the use of runes that help you interact with the world around you. There are a few more, but the main ones are the Remote Bomb, which comes as either a block or a ball and can be remote detonated to use at your will. Magnesis, which allows you to control metal objects by using the slate as a giant magnet of sorts. Stasis, which freezes an object in time for a short period. And Cryonis, this creates a pillar of ice on top of water to use as a potential platform. Each of these runes can be used to manipulate the world around you, as well as your enemies, and brings with it an almost unlimited amount of creativity with regards to problem solving. These are all such simple additions, but they give the player variety and choices to make, and ultimately that's what Breath of the Wild does so well. You feel empowered, and that's no bad feeling to have in a video game. That doesn't mean that Breath of the Wild is flawless, however, because, well, it isn't. It can be argued that the story is weaker than other recent Zelda titles like Wind Waker or Twilight Princess. And because the game takes place 100 years after your friends were alive, lots of Link's interactions with important characters are through flashbacks that you can easily miss if you don't actively search for them. Weapon degradation is another major addition to the game, which I'm not sure was implemented as well as it could have been. You have a limited number of hits before your weapons break, including the Master Sword, by the way, which is fine, but it brings with it some major pluses and minuses. On the plus side, you are in charge of managing which weapons you use, and have to think tactically about how you're going to attack your enemy, knowing that you might ultimately lose your best weapon if you are not careful. Again, freedom to the player is a great thing, especially when it empowers you. However, you're more likely to hold back from using weapons that you might like to play with because you never know when you're going to need them, which tends to leave you using weapons that either you don't like or are underpowered. Now, I actually like having weapons that break, it adds a sense of realism and tactical play, but maybe allowing weapons to be fixed or even doubling the amount of times that you can use them would have made it less controversial. As it is, it's definitely one of the most divisive things they added to the game. Which actually brings me to another controversial subject. Shrines. Oh, and dungeons. Now, I can see why people don't like shrines, especially when some of them just repeat with little variation. I'm looking at you, tests of strength. But I did like finding them, especially when I'm just stumbling around Hyrule. Early on, they teach you the basics of the game and showcase just how much freedom you're afforded with each new rune you collect by challenging you with some really interesting puzzles. They also added a further element to exploration because searching for them led you into new territories, which I loved. The dungeons, though, they're fine, but they're just boring. There isn't much difference between any of the dungeons, and the bosses are way too similar to feel like they're specific to either the dungeon or the region you're in. Again, they're not bad, just dull. You are given the freedom to explore, and it makes you appreciate it even more because you're not always given that kind of limitless freedom in games. This goes beyond exploration too, as you can embrace as much or as little of the story as you'd like. You can explore any of the dungeons in any order you fancy, or you can ignore them completely. You can take on side quests, search for forgotten memories that fill in the blanks, or even find and trade lots of poo. And if you really want to, you can head straight to big old Mr. C. Ganon the second you decide to put some trousers on, though I wouldn't recommend it. The problem with games where the ultimate end goal is deathly important is that if you were too busy chasing chickens around a field to, beat the bad guy, it breaks your immersion of that world. And the longer that you spend away from the main quest, the more and more that immersion breaks. By giving you the option of going straight after Ganon, you feel a sense of freedom that you might not feel in other games. You're likely to get beaten, but you can still try. This also gives quests meaning because completing the dungeons, navigating your way through each shrine and finding the Master Sword rewards you by doing a number of things. It damages Ganon, fills up your stamina and health bars, and makes your chance of victory and end goal that much easier. And it's still your choice. You don't have to do any of this, but then you can do all of this. When games lead you from main quest to remain immersed in the world, you would in theory have to follow it until the end, because in the real world the consequences would be dire if you didn't. By allowing you the freedom to take your time and by putting emphasis on building up your strength to take on Ganon, it actually makes sense. Breath of the Wild succeeds because it challenges the player to actively solve problems rather than having us rely on gaming logic we've been absorbing all these years. Even with flaws that are fairly present, Breath of the Wild still manages to shine because the core gameplay and exploration it provides is not only unique but implemented to perfection. In my opinion, it could be the best launch title in history, though that's a topic for another day. After nearly 200 hours, I still feel a sense of awe when navigating my way through Hyrule, and although it's not perfect, the freedom it provides the player is what draws us in, and after 3 years keeps us coming back again and again.